Finally, we're going to have a lecture here that is essentially a conversation about how we're not going to have this conversation. There are a lot of terms and interesting discoveries that people have made about color theory. We, in some cases, will have an entire semester that is a nothing but color theory class. We're not going to do that here at CSU, go Rams, in part because so much of how you use color is dependent on what kind of material you're using. Color is going to operate completely differently in paint than it does in additive color on a screen, than it does in a camera, than it does in printmaking, etc. There are some terms that people who are really interested in the formal aspects of a color theory course will use. I'm going to define some of them here and then mostly tell you that if that's something you're interested in, talk to me and I can give you some resources to further explore them. In our class, we're going to be pretty focused on how color actually works as opposed to all the things that are exclusive to color theory. There are things that you will see over the course of the semester where I'm more interested in you guys making artwork than I am in you guys illustrating some formal foundations, color theory, compositional theory point. So we've got some terms. Some of them are useful. You'll hear them every now and then coming out of my mouth, but we aren't going to spend as much time on these as we are on actually using color and thinking about how it affects our compositions and our artwork. One thing that we do want to know is often described as the interaction of color. Color interaction, sometimes also known as simultaneous contrast, sometimes also known as relative color. One of the things you're going to pick up on in this class is that art people cannot agree on what to call anything. So we have like 6 different terms that all mean the same thing or don't, depending on who you're asking. I'm going to go ahead and say that for our class, color interaction, simultaneous contrast, relative color are all talking about the same concept, which is essentially that depending on what you put it next to, a color will look different. So if I take the same purple and put it next to a light blue, it will seem darker than when I put that purple on a dark blue. Or if I have purple surrounded by its complement, yellow, it's going to seem much brighter and more purpley than when I put it next to something that's a lot closer in value and a little bit cooler. And so they're going to read differently. I see a dark purple on top of that yellow. I see a light purple on top of that gray-green. We're going to understand color interaction as something that you need to account for when you're putting colors next to each other in juxtaposition, but also in terms of optical color mixing, when we create small little dots of color that our eye is going to blend together. When we think about how we're going to mix them, some of this is still going to show up, but most of the time when we're talking about color interaction, simultaneous contrast, or relative color, it's I have a solid color next to another solid color. What do they do to each other? A lot of this is coming from Joseph Albers, who literally wrote the book called The Interaction of Color. And he actually made hundreds, literally hundreds of paintings called the Homage to the Square, and he differentiated them by numbers. So Homie made at least 732 of these, which all basically follow this format. It's 3 squares superimposed on each other in an offset center, and he's just sort of playing with what do the colors look like when I layer this color next to this color next to this color. And if that is the kind of thing that you are interested in doing in art, then let me know and I can give you some books to look at, and it'll be so really boring. Really? You're going to do that 732 times? Admittedly, Joseph Albers knew more about the interaction of color when he died than anybody ever alive, but Homie's dead now, and I don't know how much good it does him. What you should really do is look up his wife, Annie Albers, who also taught at the Bauhaus and is a much more interesting artist visually, and she was textiles, so we aren't always looking at nothing but paint. She is my placeholder here for us to also talk about complementary colors. One of the things that we're going to see is that that in addition to describing complements by their definition, colors that are equidistant on a color wheel, what we're also going to see is that sometimes people will try to come up with terms for the way in which complementary colors interact, one of which is what's known as opponent theory. And the idea behind opponent theory is that if you have two complements next to each other in juxtaposition, they'll push against each other in such a way that they both look stronger or higher intensity. The green looks greener because it's next to red. The red looks redder because it's next to green. This is opponent theory. However, some people will use that same definition but assign it to the term simultaneous contrast. In the previous slide, or I guess 2 slides ago, we were saying that simultaneous contrast was just a description of how colors look different depending on what you put it next to. Some people will say that simultaneous contrast is only about complementary colors, and they'll use relative color or interaction of color to talk about that instead of using simultaneous contrast. Couple of other things that we want to know. Essentially, we're going to be talking about a lot of the things that people map out in color theory in future assignments. They're big issues like the projection or recession of color. Certain colors seem like they come forward. They tend to be warm colors, high intensity colors, lots of contrast seems like it comes forward. Cool colors or low intensity colors are going to look like they go back in space. So for instance, in the half on the top of this image, we're going to read that yellow as solid. It seems like a warm color that's coming towards me, like a raft on a river, whereas the blue rectangle feels less solid when it's surrounded by the yellow. It feels like a hole or like a swimming pool. We're going to talk about this a lot more. Just be aware of the fact that, yes, our eyes are going to interpret color almost always in several ways, not only spatially, not only in terms of the color theory assignments of what's a primary color, etc., but also emotionally and things like that. So again, there's a lot that we could be covering with color theory that we're going to kind of gloss over, because if I made you do this assignment, which I had to do when I was your age, where we take the same purple and we put it in different contexts so that the simultaneous contrast makes it look different, if I made you do that, this is the facial expression all of you would have. We would be so bored. So what we're going to do is think a lot about color theory, but try to apply it to the making of images. It's not going to feel like that at the very beginning because we are going to do some charts and some very introductory things, but most of our color conversations are going to happen in the context of you trying to achieve an image of some kind.